go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We are reading through the Gammage Cup. We are starting with chapter 16. My cat is here to keep us company. We are hopefully going to get through a couple of chapters today. We are reading this in honor of my 6th grade teacher. Sorry, I'm just watching my cat. What are you doing, bud? What are you doing? You're on camera. So offended. Oh my gosh. Okay. So we are reading the Gammage Cup in honor of my 6th grade teacher who passed away in December, and this was one of her favorite books. She read it to every single class, including my class, and so I am reading it now in her honor on YouTube. We are starting off at chapter 16. If you have not caught up with any of the previous chapters, if you missed anything in the story, there's a playlist on my YouTube channel that you can go watch of all of those, and then you can come back here. So without any further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started. Chapter 16. The only good mushroom is a cooked mushroom. Muggles, Maxims. They were so weary and so stunned over the day's happenings that, talk as they would, they could think of no effective way of stopping the invaders. And for all we know, said Curly Green, they might even be some sort of wild animal. How can we know how to deal with them when we don't even know what they are? Wild animals don't build fires on mountaintops, but the rest of what you are saying is true enough, said Walter the Earl, and he fell to brooding over the problem while the others went on talking around him. When night fell, they took turns keeping watch over the knoll through the long, dark hours, each guard brewing a pot of sassafras tea for the next to start off with. But nothing untoward happened beyond a little skirmish between Gummy and an owl that tried to stare him out of countenance until Gummy hooted back at it and frightened it away. Muggles' watch was the last, when the night was old and the moon already sunk over the Sunset Mountains. To keep herself awake, she brought bowls and spoons and ingredients out on the grass and stirred up batter for a breakfast honey cake. As the first rays of the sun streaked into the valley, Minji grumbled and sat up. For a moment, he looked about him in a dazed way, and then, as he saw the other sleepers, a slow smile spread over his face. But when he noticed Muggles watching him, he replaced the smile with an embarrassed frown. "Morning," he said gruffly. "Anything happen?" Muggles held up the bowl. "Nothing but a honey cake." "Good." He swung round to look toward the mountain, which was almost obscured by the trees. "You frightened?" No, said Muggles. "Well, I mean, yes." "Don't be. Won't get you anywhere. I'll go bathe." And he loped off down the little trickle. After a hearty breakfast of the steaming honey cake, eaten outside within easy reach of the swords, the outlaws held their council of war. Gummy and Curly Green were all for raising an alarm in the village. Muggles and Minji were uncertain, but Walter the Earl, who had slept with his stout ash plant in his hand, now thumped it decisively on the ground. "Facts," he snapped at them. "We've got to have facts. Good, solid, hard facts that they will have to listen to. And the fact of the matter is, at this moment, we haven't the slightest idea what we are up against. We are only guessing that the mushrooms, or the hairless ones, have come again. We don't know this. We haven't seen anything. And if the swords frighten these things off each time, then we'll never catch a glimpse of them." "That's all right with me," Curly Green murmured. Walter the Earl silenced her with a stern glance. "Now, my plan is this. I shall go alone, with a sword, to the foot of the mountain, and there I shall hide myself on that big rock where we picnicked the other day, and wait for the mushrooms to appear. For, though we don't know for a fact that they come from inside the mountain, we can reason that this is so. Then, when I get some idea of what they're like, and how many there are, and what weapons they have, I shall come back and report. If we can't handle them ourselves, we can send for help." He folded his arms and sat back. "But what if you should be taken?" protested Curly Green. "It's too dangerous." "In the event that I should be captured, which is doubtful, I shall have left a message written on the rock describing these creatures. It's the only way." "He's right," Benji declared. "Only, of course, it's not Walter the Earl who will go, but me. If it comes to fighting a battle, Walter the Earl is the only one who will know what to do. We can't spare him." "You're both wrong," said Gummy. "I'm the one who should go. I'm used to stretching out in the open for long hours, because I'm such a lazy fellow. And I'll do scribbles in my head to pass the time. Besides, I know the way better than any of the rest of you, and if I'm captured, it'll be no great loss." He jumped up and clapped his peaked hat on his head. "It's all settled then." "Sit down," growled Minji. "Nothing is settled at all." So they huddled together again under the tree to decide who should go and what the rest should do. It looked as if it would never be settled, until Curly Green pointed out that the sun was getting higher with every passing minute, and the mushrooms weren't going to wait politely inside the mountain until the outlaws' minds were made up. "Very well," said Walter the Earl. "Then we will let Muggles decide. She's got the best head of the lot of us when it comes to good sense. Go ahead, Muggles." "Me?" She looked around at the other outlaws, but they were all nodding their heads in agreement with Walter the Earl's words. "My goodness, I don't know," she began, and then stopped because she realized that her mind had worked it all out for her while she listened to the wrangle. "All right," she said. "We'll have to do the jobs we're best at. Walter the Earl knows most about battles, and that's his job. Gummy is the fleetest and ablest with his tongue, so he must go to Slipper on the Water for help if we need it. Curly Green and I will undertake to feed anybody who comes from the village and help with the armor." She paused and looked at Minji for a long moment. "I think you know that Minji is the one to go to the rock. He won't lose his head no matter what happens. If he should be captured, he will know how to take care of himself until so Minji will go alone to the mountain." Minji tried to look his most ferocious, but the corners of his mouth kept going up instead of down. Walter the Earl nodded his head vigorously. "That was well thought out. Minji will go. And do you remember that high place about halfway between here and the mountain? The rest of us can wait there. We'll take the swords, and if Minji gets into any trouble, we'll be close enough to come to his rescue. Is it agreed?" "It is agreed," they all said solemnly. They looked at each other for the space of a minute, and then Gummy jumped up. "So on with the battle! We'll make their bones rattle!" They were almost ready to set off when Curly Green snapped her fingers and ran back to Gummy's stone house. She emerged with an old cloak the color of sun-warmed sand, which she pressed upon Minji. "Put this over you when you get there. It won't show up the way your green cloak will, and it has a hood to cover your head. You'll look like just part of the rock." "As long as they don't step on me," grumbled Minji. He threw the cloak over his shoulders. "Thanks." They marched quickly along the bank of the little trickle until they came to the high place, another knoll like that on which they lived. Minji watched the others climb to the top, their black swords held carefully between them, and then he waved once and set off alone upstream. Minji was used to loneliness in the village, but this was different. This was the loneliest loneliness that he had ever known. And yet, strangely, his heart was light. He hurried along beside the stream, keeping a sharp lookout all about him. As long as there were trees growing thickly to the edge of the water, he felt sheltered and safe. But soon they thinned out as the soil became rockier, and Minji felt big on the landscape. The mountains towered above him. Were there any of the mushrooms on top to see his scurrying figure below them? He made sudden sharp dashes from tree to tree, until at last he came to the great rock where they had picnicked 2 days before. Beyond it, there was no shelter in which to hide. Except for the music of the waterfall, all was quiet as he began to climb to the top of the rock. There were few toeholds, and the going was slippery. Once he almost lost the little bundle of food that he had tied to his belt, but he clutched it with one hand and hung on with the other, and at last scrambled onto the flat top, where he flopped down and panted for breath. Then he crawled forward to a shallow depression from which he could watch the face of the mountain by raising his head slightly, but be hidden from view except from the highest mine openings. Arranging the sand-colored cloak over him, he made himself as comfortable as possible on a rock in the hot sun, and settled down to wait. The knoll on which the other outlaws waited with their swords seemed far behind him, but by stretching his neck around, he could see the top of it over the scrubby trees. He almost thought he could see 4 little figures as well, but probably his eyes were only playing him tricks. He turned around to keep watch over the mine entrances. As the sun rose higher, Minji got hotter. After a while, he skinned off his own green cloak from beneath the sand-colored one and tucked it under him. Then he had a drink of cold cress tea from the brass bottle Muggles had given him, reflecting that in a few more hours it would be steaming hot cress tea, and that was a comfort. "I'll be nicely boiled myself, come to that," he told himself. "A tender morsel I'd make too," and he chuckled grimly. The morning passed as slowly as a turtle climbing out of a sunny bank. Minji yawned and fidgeted and blew his breath upward over his nose to cool it, and then downward over his chin to cool it, and fanned his hand before his face and mopped his forehead and yawned some more. He concentrated on the sound of the waterfall and tried to pretend that he was standing under it, but the thought only aggravated his thirst, and he had another sip of the tea. An early gnat found him and sung its song first in one ear and then the other. Go away, said Minji under his breath, and swatted at the pesky thing. But the gnat hummed merrily off to tickle his nose, while Minji's ears smarted from the slap he had given it. He was just beginning to believe that they had imagined the whole affair of the tapping and the sword glow when he saw the first movement on the face of the mountain. A figure appeared in the mouth of the abandoned mine, the same one the outlaws had entered 2 days ago. Minji froze like a frog watching his dinner fly in a circle above his head. The figure stole outside the tunnel and blinked into the sunlight. He motioned, and 2 others joined him, and then 2 more. Minji stared at them, his fingers digging into the rock. They were taller than Minipins by at least a head, and they wore tight brownish-white clothes that fitted like skin, so their round bellies bulged fat as puffed toads. Their heads were almost hairless and mushroom-colored like their suits, as though they lived their days in dank caves, and they had ears twice the size of Minji's own. Each one of them bore a long stick with a wicked metal point, what Walter the Earl had described as a spear. Minji shuddered and closed his eyes against the horrid creatures for a moment. These were the mushrooms, then. There could be no doubt. When he looked again, the number of mushroom people had doubled, and more were pouring out of the old mine. Minji counted 50, and still they swarmed silently onto the face of the mountain. But he had seen enough. Time to start back toward the knoll to report. First, though, he must leave a message as he had agreed, just in case. The piece of soft red wax writer felt wet in his hands as he scrawled words on the rock, hasty, terse phrases describing what he had seen. After one last look, he added, 200, and more coming. And then, every nerve in his body alert, he began to slide himself backwards across the rock. But almost at once, he stopped in dismay. At his first scraping movements, he saw the mushroom people jerk their hairless heads erect. Instantly, the flow from the mine's mouth entrance stopped, and the 200 or more mushrooms stood stock still, listening. Minji lay dead still, scarcely breathing. After long moments, he dared to lift his head again. The mushrooms were filing out of the tunnel once more, and now they were scattering about the face of the mountain, their spears ready in their hands, their heads swiveling from side to side, listening. Always listening. Minji frowned. It was absurd to think that they could have heard him move on the rock. He was too far away from them, and besides, the waterfall made too much noise. And yet something had startled them just as he moved. He watched their ugly bodies gliding about the mountainside, and then he noticed something else. They were examining each of the old mine entrances, not the way ordinary folks would, by peering inside, but by cocking those big ears at the entrances. Minji slid the wax writer cautiously out of his pocket and added a few more words to his message on the rock. At least they couldn't hear him writing, he thought with satisfaction, thankful that he was using wax rather than charcoal. Then he began to slither backward, an inch at a time. He thought that some of the mushrooms looked more alert as soon as he moved, but most of them, there must now be 300 prowling before his eyes, just went on searching. With infinite care, Minji at last reached the edge of the rock and stretched out a foot to find the first toehold. If he could once get down to the ground, with the rock between him and the mushrooms, he had no doubt that he could outrun them. Those people with the bloated brown bellies were not made for fast movement. He would have made it, but for a piece of ill luck. Just as his left foot found a crevice, and he began to ease himself over the edge, his sweaty hands slipped on the smooth surface. He clutched frantically at a knobby protuberance to save himself from falling. The little slapping noise he made was no louder than a fish's glubbing as it comes to the surface to swallow a fly, but instantly there was a savage cry from the 300 throats, and 600 legs started moving in queer, lumbering, but deathly silent lopes toward him. Spears were raised, ready to strike. Minji might outrun those legs, but he would never escape the spears. With a mutter of despair, he tried to pull himself up on the rock again, on the tiny chance that they would go on past, but his foot was caught fast in the crevice. He yanked and pulled and tried to wriggle out of the slipper, but it was no use. He was stuck fast. So he clung, half over the edge, while the mushrooms swarmed around the rock. With the wax writer, he scrawled one last message. Caught. Chapter 17. Gummy had a fleeting foot. It never did impede him. And everywhere that Gummy went, that foot was sure to lead him. It led him to the mine one day and landed him in danger. For when your foot is very fleet, then trouble is no stranger. Gummy, Scribbles, Collected Works. Back on the second knoll, it had been a long morning too, though a more comfortable one than the one that Minji spent. The four outlaws could just see the top of Minji's rock, and they stared until their eyes ached for the first sight of Minji himself. Then, perhaps 10 minutes after he had left them, Curly Green put her hand on Muggles' shoulder. "He's there," she breathed. "I can see a little wiggle where he's climbing over the edge." Then the little wiggle became once more the color of the rock, and the four outlaws settled back with a sigh to watch and wait. The morning crept by as though time had stuck. "You don't think we dreamed it all, do you?" asked Muggles at long last. "I hope so," said Gummy. He stood up and then sat down again. "Do you see anything yet, Curly Green?" She shook her head. Walter the Earl ran his finger over the black blade of his sword. With an exclamation, he did it again. "The blade feels warm." Muggles and Gummy touched their swords, but Curly Green kept her eyes fastened on Minji's rock and the face of the mountain beyond. "The sun has warmed them, surely," said Gummy. "See, they're still black." "The blade was cold to the touch a moment ago," said Walter the Earl. "Can you see anything, Curly Green?" No, she began. "Yes, there is something. It looks like ants swarming onto the mountainside." They all leaped up to stand behind her, but none of the others had eyes as sharp as hers. "There must be hundreds," she cried. "They keep pouring out of the mountain." Walter the Earl swung his sword up before him. Its blade gave forth no light, but was it their imaginations, or was it just a little less black than before? "We advance," decided Walter the Earl. Before the words were out of his mouth, the four started to run down the hill. At the foot, they plunged to the right and sped along the little trickle toward the mountain. As the trees began to thin out, they could catch glimpses of Minji's rock in the distance. "The swords!" Muggles gasped. "They're turning!" A sudden savage cry smote their ears, a terrible blow. An instant before, Muggles had thought that she could not take another step, but the dreadful noise sent her lurching onward. Her sword began to glimmer. Then she saw them, the invaders. Swarms of them pouring around Minji's rock, and Minji himself pinned like a sandfly at the top. With a cry, Gummy sprang ahead of the others and went winging over the stony ground, his sword gleaming in the sunlight. A new sound came from the things, a whimpering, weaking cry that grew louder and louder as Gummy carried his now glowing sword before him. "Weak! Weak!" They began to disappear behind the rock, but a few stood their ground and hurled a shower of spears at the oncoming Gummy. He darted aside and rushed on, untouched. "Weak! Weak! Weak!" The rest of the creatures went loping around the big rock. Muggles gave a gasp of relief. Minji was safe. She could see him move, but the last four invaders turned back. With savage hands, they wrenched Minji's foot from the crevice and tore him from the rock. Swinging him between them, they carried him off to the mountain. Gummy pursued them up to the very mouth of the old mine and plunged inside. For a moment, they could hear the white-hot flash of his sword lighting up the tunnel, and then all was blackness. "Come back!" Walter the Earl shouted, but his voice only bounced against the blank rock face of the mountain. He turned a face suddenly grown bleak to Muggles and Curly Green as they came breathlessly up to him. "Folly to go in," he said, "even with the swords." He stopped and stared at his own blade. It still flashed with the searing blue-white light, and shimmering there were letters of gold. "Read it!" Curly Green gasped. "Quick, it's beginning to fade." Walter the Earl read, "Bright when the cause is right." He slowly raised his eyes from the ancient script, which was already beginning to disappear, and stared fixedly into the mouth of the old mine. "I have half a mind to... No, Gummy will turn back when he sees it is of no use. And Minji..." He drew a sharp breath. Curly Green started back toward Minji's rock. "I'll see if he left a message." A few moments later, she signaled them from the top of the rock. When they had clambered up to her, past the scrawled "caught," Curly Green was standing in the shallow depression where Minji's green cloak still lay. The three stared down at what Minji had written on the face of the rock with his wax writer. "Mushrooms. Fat bellies, tall, hairless, carry spears 200, and more. They hear me moving, are listening, big ears, get army quick." There was a hail from the tunnel mouth. "Gummy!" He staggered out into the sunlight and slid to the ground with a groan. When they reached him, he smiled up at them, but his face was white. Blood stained the shoulder of his yellow cloak. Nothing. A scratch. I only need a little patch," he murmured, and fainted away. Chapter 18. Creeping, crawling, fat things sprawling, slithering, sliding, mushrooms gliding, sneaking, peeking, Hairless ones seeking, quivering, quaking, mini pins shaking. Gummy, scribbles, collected works. They got water from the little trickle, and Muggles bound up Gummy's left shoulder with leaves from the nearest tree and her orange sash. When she had at last finished, she saw that his eyes were open again, and color had come back to his cheeks. "You are lucky it was only a scratch," said Walter the Earl severely. "Running into the tunnel like that was folly." Gummy blinked at him and smiled. "Ah, but you should have seen the way my sword flamed to the darkness." He gave a rueful look at the blood on his cloak. "Of course, I suppose they could hardly miss me in that shower of light, though. But the way they ran, how was I to know one would be brave enough to aim at me?" "Did you see Minji again?" asked Curly Green. Gummy shook his head. "I saw nothing but the sparks from my sword. And the spear." He sat up abruptly. "Where is it? I brought it out with me." "Ah!" His hands closed on the long shaft lying beside him. "We'll have to build a museum to put it in, won't we?" "Can you walk?" Muggles asked anxiously. Gummy sprang to his feet and then clutched at Walter the Earl to hold himself steady. "I can walk, talk, stalk, balk, and pock." Pock. New word. Wonder what it means. He swayed dizzily, forcing himself upright once more. "What are y'all waiting for? A poem?" "Gummy had a little sword. Its blaze was black as night." "He's delirious," Curly Green whispered. "Nonsense," said Gummy. "I am simply overjoyed at finding myself the center of attention among minipins rather than those creatures." He looked up at the sun riding high in the sky and became very sober. "What do we do now? Go to the village for help?" He appealed to Walter the Earl. "That's right, as soon as you can travel." "Then lead on." Gummy hefted the spear in his left hand, wincing at the pain in his shoulder. On the far side of Minji's rock, they picked up the other spears that had been hurled at Gummy. They walked as fast as they could, with fearful backward glances, until the trees blotted out the mountain face. At first, Gummy stumbled along, but after refreshing himself with cold water from the stream several times, he declared that he was ready to journey to Slipper on the Water as soon as he reached the boat. Muggles shook her head worriedly and caught up with Walter the Earl, who was striding ahead. "I don't think Gummy should go," she said. "He's not really himself." "What do you mean? He seems all right. It was only a scratch." "I know, but there's something queer about the wound. I don't want to alarm everybody, and I washed it off carefully. It was kind of a sticky red substance that wasn't blood, though it looked like blood. It must have been on the spear tip, you see." With an exclamation, Walter the Earl examined the point of the spear he was carrying. "There is something on them." "Yes," said Muggles. "I am thinking it may be poison." Walter the Earl strode along silently for a few minutes. At last he spoke. "I shall go then. See here, Muggles, I'll be as fast as I can, but it may take some time arming the villagers. If I am not back here before morning with the army, will you be all right?" "Of course," Muggle said stoutly. "We have the swords to protect us." "But the spears, you must be very wary of walking outside the house." Muggles nodded. "We'll wear armor." When they had wearily climbed the knoll, Gummy slid down by a tree and closed his eyes. "In half a mo, I'll get up and go," he murmured, "but I feel slow." His eyelids fluttered open and then closed again, and his head fell back against the tree. Curly Green hurried to minister to him with cold water, while Muggles flew into the house to find her pot of herb ointment. By the time she had dressed Gummy's wound again, Walter the Earl was just rounding the bend in the boat, paddling with the fast current. They scarcely noticed that he had gone. Gummy's pulse beat quickly and then slowly. Burning with fever at one moment, he shook with chills the next. They got him wrapped into his comforter under the shelter and fed him steaming herb tea. After a while, there was nothing more to do except keep watch over him. Curly Green tried to wash the blood out of the yellow cloak, but the stains stubbornly remained. "It's not blood," she cried, looking closely at the cloth. Muggles told her about the poisoned spear points. "I hope that most of it came off on the cloak. Then, of course, the wound isn't deep." She stared gravely into Curly Green's eyes. "I think he has a chance." At tea time, they debated about where to spend the night and decided that Gummy's house was the safest place. But when they moved Gummy inside, he started up and cried out that he couldn't breathe. Try as they would, they could not quiet him, and his fever raged higher, so they finally took him out again and made up their beds in the unfinished stone house that was still open to the sky. They suspended the swords from the doorway and the 3 windows. While Curly Green built up a small fire in one corner, Muggles hastened down to the little trickle to fetch willow leaves for poultices and a supply of fresh water. The pot of ointment was disappearing at an alarming rate, so she stripped some willow bark and set it to steeping over Curly Green's fire. Then they brought 3 suits of armor and the 5 shields from Gummy's house and laid them beside the beds. "It doesn't look very comfortable," Curly Green said, eyeing the burnished metal, "but I suppose we'll be glad enough to put it on if the mushrooms come." Though it would be several hours before dark, there was a long night ahead of them to divide into 2 watches, so Curly Green rolled herself up in her bed to take the first sleep, while Muggles propped herself in the doorway under the sword, where she could keep an eye on both Gummy and on the knoll itself. As long as it was daylight, nobody could come upon them without being seen before a spear could be loosed. Muggles thought about Mingy in the mountains, and then she thought about Walter the Earl at Slipper on the Water, and then Gummy stirred, and she bathed his forehead and changed the dressing on his shoulder. The wound was inflamed, but Muggles thought it looked no worse than before. She steeped some fresh willow leaves in the bark mixture already brewing and added herbs from her stock. Then she salved a bit of the remaining ointment gently into the wound, laid the poultice on it, and bound it in place with a clean piece of cloth. Gummy muttered something under his breath. It sounded like, "Muggles has a gentle hand," and was quiet again. Muggles went back to her doorway and sat down under the black sword. When it was quite dark, she moved inside. The swords would give her a warning before the mushrooms got close to them. Curly Green slumbered peacefully on, and Gummy's breathing sounded fairly even. In a little while, she would wake Curly Green, but she wasn't really sleepy yet. The stars were bright in the sky overhead, and a few puffs of white clouds floated by. It was a night full of peace. A spear whistled through the doorway. Then a fierce cry rang out over the knoll. "Kin death! Kin death!" Muggles staggered to her feet. But the swords! They had given no warning! Stunned, she saw through the doorway by the dim light of the stars the shadowy figures of the mushrooms creeping over the knoll. Then, with a sudden wild cry, Gummy flung himself from his bed. Chapter 19. It is easier to lure a fish than to hit it over the head with a club. Muggles' maxims. Walter the Earl was well on his way down the little trickle before the feeling that he had forgotten something caught up with him. The spears. He should have brought one of the spears with him to show the mayor, but the current was sweeping him strongly downstream, and to go back now would waste precious time. No matter, Litid would see spears enough and plenty to spare as soon as he had rallied the villagers to march against the Sunset Mountains. He bent his back to the paddle. For years, ever since he was a child and first began to decipher the ancient documents that had come down to him through his family, he had tried in vain to present facts to the village of Slipper on the Water. Here, at last, was a fact that nobody could ignore. 2 hours later, he was striding up the street going to the river. The few villagers he met got very brief nods. Unconscious of their bulging eyes, he pounded on the door of the mayor's house with the knob of his ash plant. When Ave, the mayor's wife, opened to him, "I have come to see the mayor," he announced, and marched straight past her. Flinging open the door of Litid's office, he confronted Litid himself and Co, the town clerk, as they sat over a table covered with papers. "Invaders have come through the Sunset Mountains," he thundered. He was greeted by complete silence. "They have captured Mingy, and Gummy lies wounded by their poisoned spears." Now there were slack-jawed stares. Co half rose and then fell back again. Walter the Earl thumped his ash plant on the floor. "Do you understand what this means?" he demanded. "Unless they are stopped at once, they'll have us all. Every mini-pin in the valley. We must raise an army. Now, tonight." Again, he thumped the ash plant on the floor. "I have swords and armor for a band of 50. In 4 hours of fast marching, we can reach the mountains. The swords—" "He has gone out of his head," Co choked. "Don't be a fool, Co. There's no time for it." Walter the Earl turned to Litid. "We'll send the food and supplies by boat." "These invaders," Litid interjected smoothly, caressing his beard. "Have you seen them, Walter the Earl?" "Of course I've seen them. They've captured Mingy." "Ah. Suppose you tell us about them. What do they look like?" Walter the Earl gave an impatient twitch of his staff. "Like mushrooms. Great fat bellies and hideous bald heads." Co leapt to his feet, his paunch quivering and his big bald patch scarlet. "Get out of here," he yelled. "Get out, or by snowdrift and frostbite I shall tie your offensive tongue to your long nose." "Offensive?" Walter the Earl stood his ground against the advancing town clerk, raising his ash plant to defend himself. "You see that, Litid?" Co cried. "He is threatening me with his stick. He has gone mad." Litid seized his cousin's cloak and gave it a jerk. I think, he said judicially, nodding to Walter the Earl, I think you had perhaps better explain yourself. That's what I've been trying to do. Walter the Earl smote the floor with his ash plant again. The invaders are the mushrooms, the hairless ones. No, no, cautioned Litted. Let's have no more fun made of poor Co's head. I am not. Walter the Earl suddenly realized that he was shouting and abruptly lowered his voice. Making fun of Co's head. I am talking about the invaders. Yes, yes, of course, Litted said soothingly. The invaders who have come over the mountains. Not over, through. I see. Litted gave his beard a nervous jerk, but his voice still flowed like syrup. Of course. So they came through the mountains. And what then? The terrible realization was borne in upon Walter the Earl that Litted was humoring him. You've got to understand, he said desperately. This is no trick, I swear it. You would believe me if you could see Gummy. The spear has poison smeared on it. Ah, yes, this, spear. Perhaps you brought this, spear with you to show us? He did, in his imagination, Co sneered. I left in such a hurry that I forgot it, Walter the Earl said dully. Litted. He fixed his eyes steadily on the old mayor's face. Litted, let me talk to you privately. Litted wavered, but Co cried out, He'll do you harm, mark me. He's only come back to get his revenge. I won't stir from your side. There had been a faint flicker of interest in Litted's eyes, but at Co's warning, it died away. Be quiet, Co. Now, Walter the Earl, we are your friends here, and we'll hear you out. Co is just a bit hasty with his tongue, but he will be silent while you tell your story, won't you, Co? Good. Now then, you were saying that these invaders came over, or that is to say, through the mountain. Walter the Earl stared at the mayor and Co for a long minute. The mayor's face was kindly and sympathetic, Co's sneering. Both were completely disbelieving. He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, past Ave cowering in the hall and on out of the house. Standing in the middle of the marketplace, he was surprised to find that the sun had declined only a little since he had been admitted to the mayor's house. It had seemed to him that he was pleading with Litted and Co for hours. Now he must think of something else. He must find somebody who would listen to him, somebody with sense, somebody who was unafraid to face a fact. Despairingly, he looked about him at the few green-clad figures hurrying across the square. Thatch the roofer? Thatch might listen. Undoubtedly, he would listen while he rolled his garlic about with his tongue, and probably even believe the story. But what then? Would he ever be able to communicate with the rest of the villagers with his, well now? No, Thatch wasn't his mini-pin. Finn Longtooth? Too old and doddering to take fire at a new idea. Dingle the Miller? Walter the Earl's eyes lit up. Dingle was also the village songmaster and got folk to sing even when they didn't feel like singing. Perhaps, with 3 long strides, he caught up with Dingle, who was packing a tremendous sack of flour over his shoulder on his way to Loaf the baker's house. My good Dingle, may I have a word with you? It is of the utmost importance. Dingle's eyes rolled behind white powdered eyelashes. Then you can't want to talk to me, Walter the Earl. I am of no importance whatsoever, save to mill and to sing. You must go to Litted the mayor for matters of importance. He nodded toward the mayor's house, and scarcely having broken his stride, continued on his way with all speed. But Walter the Earl doggedly kept pace. I have seen the mayor, and he won't believe me, and it's a matter of life and death to the whole valley. I beg of you, panted Dingle, hurrying on, not to insist upon following me like this. If the mayor won't believe you, how can you expect me, a simple miller and songmaster, to do so? The mayor is a period, and very wise. What he does not believe, I cannot believe. Please do not make trouble for me, Walter the Earl. I am very sorry for your plight, but I can do nothing. With a final spurt, he reached the house of Loaf the baker and disappeared inside. For the first time in his life, Walter the Earl felt uncertain. All depended upon him. Even now back at the knoll, Gummy's life might be ebbing away. The mushrooms perhaps were sallying from the old mine to attack. And Minji, he dared not think what was happening to Minji. Fighting down a sudden panic that rose from the pit of his stomach, Walter the Earl forced himself to be calm and look about him. The marketplace was drowsily peaceful in the rays of the sinking sun. Occasionally a villager appeared, but one and all, when they saw him, ducked their heads into the collars of their white cloaks and elaborately went another way. Despair seized him, and then he saw Spill the candlemaker. A dim memory of something Muggles had told him about Spill prodded his mind. Was it gold pieces? Gold pieces and Minji! Walter the Earl was beside Spill before the scrawny candlemaster could avoid him. Spill, he said hoarsely. I've come for Minji's 3 gold pieces. Spill shrank away in terror from Walter the Earl's grasp. But I don't have them. Muggles said... At the memory of what Muggles had said, his face turned white, and he suddenly began to tremble. Has something... Oh, please, I'm but a poor, helpless old one, and Walter the Earl cut his babbling short. You're not too old and poor and helpless to rouse the village for him. Rouse the... Spill swallowed desperately. Listen to me, there's no time to lose. Rapidly, Walter the Earl sketched the events leading up to Minji's capture, and every now and then gave the cringing Spill a shake for emphasis. When he had finished, Spill looked at him dumbly, but the light of belief was in his eyes. I need an army, Walter the Earl said. I need every able-bodied villager capable of carrying a sword. I do not believe that the honor and courage of the ancient Minipins are dead, but it is up to you to prove it. Rouse the village for me. Get everybody together at... He frowned. Something more Muggles had said. Reedy, at Reedy's house. I'll join you there. Tell Reedy... Spill had slowly straightened his shoulders. For a moment, fire gleamed in his faded eyes. You may rely on me. He gave Walter the Earl's hand a quick clasp and then set off with an awkward lope across the marketplace. Thrum, the miller's assistant, hurrying up the small road going nowhere, stopped short to gape at the sight of old Spill leaping along like a bird with a broken wing. From some hidden depth of his lungs, Spill bawled at him. I want every villager at Reedy's house! Spread the word! It's life or death! The invaders have come! Thrum's eyes almost started from his head. Then with a half-strangled cry, he darted to the nearest cottage, where he pounded on the door. To Reedy's house, he shouted. The invaders have come! Sound the alarm! Invaders! Spread the word! Spill hammered on the next door with both fists. They have carried off Minji and wounded Gummy to near death! Doors opened all along the quiet small road going nowhere, and bewildered villagers poured forth. What's happening? Who is it? Invaders! Invaders! Thrum bellowed. To Reedy's house! Spread the word! He turned and sped back toward the marketplace. To Reedy's house! Sound the alarm! Spill went flying on down the small road going nowhere to alert Reedy. And now the villagers took up the cry, until Walter the Earl was almost deafened by the din. He didn't wait for more. Plunging into his old house, he tore at the trapdoor in the fireplace, half fell down the ladder into the vault. There wasn't time to put on the armor, but he took time anyway, his mind racing far ahead of his fingers. Then he flung one of the jeweled war cloaks about his shoulders, snatched up a shield, sword, and a trumpet, and clambered up the ladder to his house and out into the marketplace. Thrum was just racing back from the road pointing to Snowdrift. Behind him came a straggle of villagers making for Reedy's house. Thrum gasped at the sight of Walter the Earl, veered in his direction. Here. Walter the Earl thrust the trumpet at him. Blow on this to summon the rest, and then come to Reedy's. He turned down the small road going nowhere, but not before he had caught a glimpse of Litted and Co. in the middle of the square, helplessly trying to stem the overwhelming tide of villagers that poured past them. Thrum blew a shattering blast on the trumpet, and then another and another, as Walter the Earl threaded his way toward the last cottage on the road. Villagers milled about Reedy's house, but they fell back before the glittering war cloak and armor as Walter the Earl thrust his way to the door. There he is, ran the excited Buzz. The great warrior. Did you hear what Reedy said? He's got one of the swords. It turns brighter than the sun. That's what Reedy said. When she saw Walter the Earl, Reedy jumped down from the overturned basket she had been standing on, Spill and Crambo on either side. They're all ready to listen to you, she said quietly. The Earl's in the village. Let's check in with Minji. Chapter 20. The best thing to do with a bad smell is to get rid of it. Muggles' maxims. Minji came to his senses slowly. His head swimming, he started to pull himself upright, but a sharp pain stabbed at his foot, and he let himself fall back onto the damp floor. A candle guttered over his head, and a drop of hot wax fell onto his forehead. He stifled the groan that rose to his lips, but the hot wax seemed to clear his foggy mind. He remembered the hideous hairless ones dancing about him while he was pinned to the rock, and then a glimpse of Gummy racing toward him, his sword all but bursting into flame. But what happened then? He remembered a sharp, wrenching pain in his foot. Yes, that was it. The mushrooms had ripped him from the rock and borne him helpless into the mountain. They'd thrown him down inside the doorway of a cavernous room where candles cast a dim light and there was an overpowering smell of damp mushroom. As the hairless ones gathered around him, their puffy bellies jostling each other, he realized that the smell came from them. They jabbered at him and prodded him with their long, clammy white fingers. Then they began to argue among themselves, and the smell got stronger as they became more excited. Minji watched them dispassionately until it suddenly occurred to him that they were discussing what to do with their captive. One of them, whose stomach protruded further than the rest, seemed to have the main voice in the argument. The others kept raising their spears against Minji and chanting something like, "Kin death! Kin death!" But the leader, he of the biggest belly, shook his head each time with an explosive "Nath!" As if to emphasize his feelings. He took hold of Minji's hair and shook it until Minji was afraid his head would snap off at the neck. But apparently, one "Nath" from Big Belly was worth more than a room full of kin deaths, for the leader got his way. Minji was shoved roughly against the wall and left alone. The mushrooms then squatted down about the cavern. There was a stir from the opposite end of the room, and an odor of hot, rancid stew came wafting to Minji's nose. Soon they were all gulping noisily and sucking their fingers. Suddenly, the leader gave an order. "Slurth and Goth!" There was some grumbling, but Biggest Belly repeated the order, and one of the mushrooms brought a bowl of the repulsive stew to Minji's side, delivering a kick in the leg for seasoning. Minji turned away from the bowl and the mushroom, seeing that, snatched it up greedily and poured it down his own throat with a great smacking and gurgling. The pain in Minji's foot had grown steadily worse, but nobody came to tend to him. At last he could feel the room going black before his eyes. He came to himself later, how much later he had no idea, to see the mushrooms still in the cavern, but now they were dipping the wicked points of their spears into a pot of red, sticky stuff. One of them carelessly swung his spear around after it was smeared red and nicked another mushroom. Immediately there was an outcry. Somebody fetched a metal pot from the corner near Minji, hastily dipped a finger in, and painted the tiny scratch with a thick white substance. Minji noted that the pot was put back in the same corner after its use. Perhaps the white stuff would help his foot if he could ever get to it. Minji tried to pull himself up to look at the foot, but the pressure on it made him black out again. This time when he came to his senses, and the hot wax dripped on his forehead, he was alone in the cavern. The hairless ones were gone, and only the lingering dank mushroom smell remained to tell Minji he hadn't been dreaming. Then he thought of the pot of white stuff. Cautiously, he raised himself from the damp floor so that he could crawl. The pain in his foot made him stop every few yards, but he gritted his teeth and started out again after a few moments' rest. When at last he reached the metal pot, he lay beside it, gasping for breath. Then came the agony of stripping off his woven slipper. Muggles would do it so that it wouldn't hurt, he thought. But Muggles wasn't here. Muggles was safe on the knoll. He sat holding one part of the slipper in his hand as the meaning of this spear dipping struck him. What he had witnessed was an army getting ready for battle. In a frenzy, Minji tore at the slipper, unmindful of the agony. He stripped it off and, plunging his hand deep into the middle pot, brought out a great glob of the white substance, which he plastered on his bruised and swollen foot. It was cool, with a soothing coolness that drew the pain magically out of the flesh. Minji slumped against the wall with relief. He must make a plan. How far away Ko seemed to be now. Ko had once said that Minji had a money box mind. It was not meant to be a compliment, but Minji chose to think of it as one. Very well, he would now put his money box mind to work. First, he must find something to eat, or he wouldn't be strong enough to act when the time came. That was easy. While crawling across the floor, he had been plagued by the packet of food tied to his belt. Quickly, he opened it and began to munch on the bread and fish cakes Muggles had packed for him early that morning. The tea in the brass bottle tasted metallic, but it was strong and wet on his parched tongue. Second, he must find the way out of the mountain. There were 2 entrances in the room, one at either end. Closing his eyes, Minji called up a picture of his arrival at the cavern. He had been slung down like a bag of meat almost as soon as they entered. Therefore, the way back to the valley was through the nearest doorway. With satisfaction, Minji took another swallow of the strong tea. Third, he must do something that would help the Minipin army to destroy the invaders, always supposing that there was an army by this time. The mushrooms must not be allowed to escape through the mountain, only to come back again and again. This was a more difficult problem and would take a great deal of pondering. It was idle to suppose that the mushrooms had gone off, leaving him completely unguarded. Anyway, whatever his job was, it did not consist of escaping. Somehow he had to cut off the mushrooms from the outside world. Minji extracted another fish cake from the packet and settled himself to a good, long, hard ponder. And I will see everybody there. Thank you so much for coming, and I will see you soon. Bye.